Hello everyone, welcome back to another Deltarune Theory. Woohoo! It's been a month. Time for another one. Actually, it might have been more than a month, now that I think about it. Anyway, here we are. As always, just to start us off, thanks for watching the last video. That one did pretty well, so I'm happy, because that was my big master theory, sort of. And also, this is basically going to be like a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to be presenting to you with a very natural voice and very minimal editing. So if that frustrates you, understandably, I'm sorry. This video is probably just not going to be very fun for you. Anyway, someone on the last video left a comment for me and said, "You talk about Alvin Night a lot." I'm paraphrasing. "You should make a video about it." And I was like, okay, so here we are. I want to start this video just sort of generally talking about the night and kind of like leading you in a direction, and then I'll get to the full Alvin Night analysis, let's say. So to start out, I want to start with homework. I always start with this. The only thing I have for you is Shadows on the Wall, which is the last theory I put out. It's, like I said, kind of my master theory. So if you want to know all the, deep connections that I might have that make me think this is the most possible choice, then you can watch that video. But I am going to sort of relitigate it here when it's important. So it's not entirely required, but I do think it's a fairly convincing theory. A lot of people very much like it, or at least from the comments of that video that have watched it. People who didn't like it and clicked off in 3 seconds, I guess, didn't leave a comment. So my percentages are all screwed up, but whatever. I think it's good, and if you enjoy this one, you'll probably enjoy it. So anyway, moving on. So we're going to do a little classic who, what, when, where, how, and why. I mixed up the last two, but in reverse. So we're starting with how, and this is one of the only things we actually know about the Knight, because we are only in chapter 2. The Knight is still a very mysterious character. We know how the Knight creates dark fountains. Queen says, "The Night, the roaring night, today it deigned to create this world. Reaching its long hand to the sky, it coursed its will into its blade and made, thrusting the fountain from the earth." A little note. Right before this, Queen says, "the will, the determination." So will in this sense is basically determination as we know it, or at least that's how it's being presented. It might be an intentional red herring, but for now, we're under the belief that coursing your determination into a blade and striking it into the ground creates a dark fountain, which kind of makes sense given that darkeners kind of seem like objects brought to life, and we know that that can happen through determination because of Flowey. Anyway, moving on. So why? Why is the Knight doing this? This is another big question. From what we can sort of infer based on Ralsei's descriptions and at least what King was saying, it seems like the Roaring Knight wants to cause the roaring, the world-ending event that Ralsei describes in Chapter 2, where too much darkness overflows and then suddenly the Titans are rising up and the Darkners all turn to stone and blah blah blah. Of course, this is a little bit uncertain because, for one, our two sources on this sort of information, King and Ralsei, are very biased in one direction and the other. King is very biased on the side of the Knight, whereas Ralsei is very biased against the Knight, assuming that the Knight is going to cause this apocalyptic event, because Ralsei is very against that happening, obviously. So it's very possible the Knight could be doing what they're doing for a different purpose, and just like Queen, are unintentionally causing events to play out that may cause the roaring. I think this is especially plausible right now, because if the Knight really wanted to create the roaring, why doesn't the Knight just create 3 dark fountains in a day? You know? I don't know. Maybe it's really tiring to create a dark fountain, but it's hard to say. We've seen Chris do it and then instantly fall asleep. So maybe there's something to that. But it was also nighttime and they want to blend in with everyone else. So you know, it could just be that as well. But when Birdley gathered all the power in Chapter 2 to create a Dark Fountain, it didn't seem to take that much out of him, but who knows? Maybe that's the reason, but it does seem like the Knight is at least intentionally creating the Dark Fountains, like, one at a time so we can close them, which, if they want to create the Roaring, seems weird. So, we're already getting into uncertain territory. Yippee! Alright, where? This is actually quite important, because the two locations where the fountains were created are the computer lab and the unused classroom in the back of the school. So, you know, if the Knight is an adult and just, like, walked into the school, it'd be weird. You know what I mean? Like, they have to, like, fit into the school environment. And I think this is especially true because there are so many, like, there's so many characters we get the chance to talk to at the end of Chapter 2 and Chapter 1, specifically with the school, is what I meant to say. Where you think if there was someone weird who attended the school that day, somebody would talk about it. Like Toriel would talk about it, or Alphys would talk about it, or one of the school kids would talk about it, or even like one of the parents of a school kid would talk about it. You'd think if someone was there and they weren't being very sneaky, it would be kind of like an event that you'd hear about. Like if, okay, even Burger Pants, right, who went to the school. If Burger Pants, I guess Pizza Pants in this universe, went to the school in the middle of the day, people would talk about that, right? Like, oh, that weird guy came to the school today for some reason. So I feel like if the Knight did indeed visit the school to create this fountain and didn't, like, sneak in during the night or something, then they have to be somebody who sort of fits into that environment. Also, there is potential they could sneak in, I suppose, but we haven't seen any evidence of that. And it would be interesting considering something else I've speculated in the past. But again, I'll get to that at the very end. I'm going to do all my speculations at the very end. I think also, given what we were just talking about with the Knight's unwillingness to, like, create 3 fountains at once, it would seem that the Knight has some sort of connection to these 2 places, right? Because, again, if the Knight just wanted to create the Roaring, why don't they just, like, do dark fountains in, like, their bathroom and their kitchen and their living room where no one else can get to them and shut them down, right? Why are they choosing these public places? There's got to be a reason. So there should be some connection between a Knight candidate and the library and school, which, for a lot of the Knight candidates, which are just, like, the kids in the class, like Chris or Noelle or Susie, it's just, like, opportunity, essentially. That's the only reason it's those places. But if it's anyone outside of the specific class of Chris's, then it seems a bit weird. So when? This is also basically kind of what I was leading into before. When I said, I guess the Knight could sneak in in the middle of the night, but they'd have to, like, break in, and, like, how did they do that? We don't know when the fountains were created. And this is a big sticking point kind of for this theory. Because, like, oh, maybe the fountain was created over the weekend and nobody was at the school. Or, oh, maybe the Chapter 2 Dark Fountain was created during the night so that Chris could actually be the Knight. Which I feel like that's kind of an elephant in the room. It's like, we saw Chris create a Dark Fountain. Why do you think they're not the Knight? You kind of have to justify that. And I'll get to that later. But for now, just talking generally, we don't know when the Knight created these fountains. But we do have some evidence that we can kind of use to just generally say, probably in this general time frame, right? The computer lab fountain, it does seem kind of weird. It could have been created at night and that Noelle and Burley would just walk into it, you know what I mean, without taking notice of it at all. Like when Chris and Susie opened the fountain, it was enough to disturb Susie to be like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. Would Noelle and Burley really just walk in there and then never mention this weird thing that happened to them? And And the same thing is true, kind of, with the storage room and the unused classroom, storage closet, mind you. You'd think the storage closet would actually be used, right? And like, there's some doubt there because there's like no darkeners in that dark world, so maybe it's like completely empty. But you'd think a storage closet would be used by teachers at least like once a week to stock up on stuff like, I don't know, chalk. Clearly there must have been some supplies there because Alphys sends Chris and Susie to the closet to get the chalk in chapter 1. So the fountain can't be there for that long. Also, I've got this video by a YouTuber named Nighthawk who's been doing character analyses for the analyses, however you say it, for the Deltarune characters. I think this Ralsei analysis has a very good point. That Ralsei really seems like he was like literally born yesterday, you know what I mean? Like and at the start of chapter 2, he's like, I've never waited so long for my friends to arrive, which would be weird for someone who has been alive for more than a day, because that's all the time he was waiting. Then again, that could be a meta joke because it took like 2 years in real life, so it's hard to say. Like, all of this is really hard to nail down. But I just think the time frames kind of, sort of, align with the idea that the Dark Fountains were created pretty recently before we explore them. That's pretty much it. So what? This is actually a question I hadn't given much thought, but what is the knight? Do we even really know that? We're assuming the knight is like an individual who is creating these fountains, but we've never seen them, and they're described so vaguely. Is the knight even a single person? Like, is it possible the knight is just the term used by Darkners to refer to the person that creates their fountain, or something like that? And in that case, it could be like, oh, the first fountain was created by Noelle, and it was supposed to go on an adventure with Susie. And then the second fountain was created by somebody else who was in the computer lab, and blah, blah, blah. I think it's kind of silly, because it would require multiple people to have knowledge of how dark fountains work instead of just one in the town. But it isn't impossible. It's also possible that it could have been done like accidentally, right? Without prior knowledge. Like, they would just drop their pencil on the floor while they were really determined. I don't know if that's how it would work, but who knows, right? Another question is the knight a lightener? Which I missed the N in lightener in the slides. It just says lighter. Is the knight a lighter? Probably not. A lightener? The reason this is even a question is because King hates lighteners, but King loves the knight. So it kind of raises the question of like, well, if King hates lighteners, why do they love the knight so much? Wouldn't he also hate the knight, even though the knight opened this fountain? Is he just loyal to the knight because the knight gave him power? It's not impossible, but it's not really the way he like makes it sound, you know? Like, he makes it sound like it's an us versus them sort of argument between the knight's side and the lightener's side. So it's like, how does that really work? I'm going to talk about this again more later when we actually get into Alvin, but I do think it's something that your knight theory kind of has to reckon with, at least a little. This is another big reason why I don't really buy Chris Knight, because unless it was some weird agreement between King and Chris to like do this whole pretend act, and then Chris defeats King, so like what was even the point of putting King in power, then I don't know how that really works. So yeah, this is just my opinion. And the final question here is the knight even real? Now this is like full-on conspiracy brain, but again, the only person who's actually apparently seen the knight is King. Queen saw the knight's work and has the vision of a knight creating a fountain in her mansion. She's got like a videotape of it. How do we know that the knight isn't just like some natural process? I guess it's possible that the knight is some natural counterbalancing process that opens a dark fountain, and then we are sealing it with Ralsei. How do we know that Ralsei is telling the truth? We really don't. We kind of suspect that he probably isn't telling the full truth because he withheld information about the roaring until it was relevant. So, you know, if you want to go big brain conspiracy mode, there is no night in Ba Sing Se. So then, who? Final question. And the answer, for me, I think, right now, is Father Alvin. So let's break it down. Alvin's traits that make him a good knight candidate. So I'm going to read out the point and then kind of go into detail a little bit. So Alvin's a turtle, and therefore he has natural armor. When you enter the dark world, obviously, traits about you kind of inform your appearance. It kind of seems like. Again, there's no definite proof anywhere around here. But, like, Noelle becomes a priest, or, like, has, like, the cloak. A cleric, maybe, let's say. Sort of like a video game healer type. Based on her personality of being so nice and wanting to help everybody. Susie gets, like, a big axe and spikes everywhere, which is kind of based on her personality. And Chris gets armor, kind of like a knight, which, well, that does help with the Chris Knight theory, but, you know, like I said earlier, there's some issues there. Turtle, obviously, has natural armor, so going into the dark world, that natural armor could definitely translate into sort of knight's armor. Also, I think it's kind of underrated as a quality. Alvin is also kind of in charge of the church, right? And I think sort of a typical role for that is sort of like someone who's... How do I want to say it? The typical, like, stereotypical sort of person that would be running a church like that is someone who's very kind and protective. So let's say maybe that would cause armor to generate that way as well. Just from a personality standpoint, sort of the same as like Susie's abrasive personality making spikes. I don't know, something I thought I'd bring up. So, Alvin's father, which is Gerson, of course, used to be a teacher and an author, making connections to both the school and the library. Now, I think this is a very strong point, and I think it's really the basis for a lot of people to believe that Alvin could be the knight, is that Alvin's father has these connections to these two places that are the two places we've seen a Dark Fountain at. And obviously, Alvin doesn't have connections to the Dreamer House, where the Chapter 3 fountain is going to be, but assuming that Alvin is the knight, and that the knight isn't Chris, the Chapter 3 fountain is going to be kind of a break from the norm, or at least what we've been doing so far, which kind of tracks with the way the development seems to be going. Toby's talked about it as like a less story-driven chapter and a more like goof character chapter, which would make sense if this was a fountain not created by the knight, but by somebody else. Just saying. Anyway, having connections to both the school and library really does help with Alvin's chances here, because like I was saying in the how do you do fellow kids slide about the knight having to kind of blend into the school, well, if Alvin was to enter the school, people would not really find it that weird, because especially if he was going to the unused classroom, which was run by Gerson, of course, because they could see it as, you know, Alvin clearly still has some issues around his father's passing, right? Like, he hasn't got over it yet, or, you know, moved on, let's say. So I think people would kind of respect his privacy. And then that also explains why they're not talking about it to us. Like, you know, it was a thing that happened, but it would be kind of awkward to just say, hey, I'm going to open up this drama about this, for what we know, pretty chill guy in town. Like, I don't know. It makes the most sense to me how an adult would be in the school without it being something people would think was, you know, worth mentioning. And of course, the library is just north of the church, so it's really not that far for him to go. And, you know, it's apparently also, this is something I was going to bring up later, but, you know, it actually does kind of tie in here. Miss Boom is apparently somebody that Birdley is working for, and we see Birdley working at the library in Chapter 1. So I wonder if maybe even, like, Gerson's wife works at the library, or if it's, like, Gerson's sister. Clearly, because Alvin's Well, it would be Gerson's wife if it was Alvin's mom. Anyway, Boom is Gerson's last name, and assumedly Alvin's last name as well. So there being another Boom at the library would also give him an excuse to visit where nobody would see it as weird, right? Okay, moving on. Alvin is religious, obviously. Therefore, has a motive to create the angel's heaven, which we see in Rousse's prophecy as like the end result of the story. And the church has double doors, indicating there may be a dark fountain there eventually. I think that's pretty much guaranteed. Like, we've kind of built up going to church eventually. Like, Rudy says he wants to go to church at the end of chapter 2. So I feel like that's going to be a fountain. We'll see. Spampton has a point that kind of gives some evidence to the Alvin Knight theory. He says, speaking of communion, Chris, did you know that the night... No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Too many excess vacation days? Take a goddamn vacation straight to hell. So communion is a religious term, as well as just like a general sort of term for connecting things. But let's see the communion definition from like Wikipedia here. It says the elements of the Eucharist, which I'm not super religious, so sorry if I'm mispronouncing anything. Bread and wine are consecrated on an altar or a communion table and consumed thereafter. Christians generally recognize a special presence of Christ in this rite, though they differ about exactly how, where, and when Christ is present. So it's based off of essentially the Last Supper, where the bread is meant to represent Jesus's body and the wine his blood. So I do think there's a lot you can read into here, especially that Spampton seems to like get a message from somewhere and go, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to like spoil it or something, and then says too many excess vacation days, take a goddamn vacation straight to hell. And of course, hell also has religious connotations. Jevil in chapter 1 says hell's roar bubbles forth or something, which could again tie roaring night, hell, Spampton talking about the night, hell, communion. It's all religious sort of stuff. I do think it's interesting though, because there's a lot of talk also about our other mysterious being who is the angel, and there's a chance that the angel is like, you know, the player or Gaster or any number of characters, Asriel. It's a term that was mentioned in the original Deltarune prophecy from Undertale. So that being their sort of Jesus-like figure, I guess you could say, the bread and wine representing the blood in the body. I don't know. There's something to that, especially with the way that monster funerals work, right? Where you have the dust, which represents the body, and bread is made of like wheat, so it kind of goes together, wheat and flour and all that. And then the object, which represents their like being, that you also bury with the dust, which kind of like blood or soul, maybe you can maybe make something out of that, is all I'm saying. Next point, Alvin's a new character. I think this is a fairly big point in his favor that I don't see a lot of people talking about, because while yes, it would be interesting if like Papyrus was the knight, and I do think there's a fair amount of evidence that you could potentially use to convince someone that Papyrus is the knight, or even that like, I don't know, Asriel's the knight or something like that. Would it really make sense to make an entirely new story that, well connected to Undertale, is its own thing, like Toby has made clear several times? It's not Undertale 2, right? Would it really make sense to make the main villain for like most of the story an old character that you kind of have to understand Undertale to get? Like, again, I know this game is meant for people who have played Undertale, but is it really worth it? That's all I'm saying. I think it makes much more sense if a new character is this main villain, because then you can go in any direction you want. You don't have to worry about previous preconceptions of the character. And again, you could make plenty of arguments that I think are fairly convincing about Papyrus being the knight and creating fountains to find friends and stuff. But you have to then deal with the baggage of Papyrus from Undertale and everything. Like, I mean, even Sans just existing in this world was enough to make theorists create theories that, oh, Sans originated from Deltarune before he went to Undertale, you know? Like, there's even just him existing here was enough for people to connect it back to Undertale. And I'm guilty of that too with like the determination video and stuff. It's hard not to connect things to Undertale. So I think making the main villain another connection to Undertale is a bad idea. I don't know. It's just me personally. Another line from the game. The closet is spacious and full of old electronics. A large person could easily fit inside. This is in reference to the closet in the computer lab where the Dark Fountain is made. And a lot of people presume this is where the knight created the fountain. Because then, if the knight isn't Noelle or Birdley, who secretly did it while the other one wasn't looking, and the fountain wasn't created the night before, which kind of seems likely considering all the factors I mentioned earlier, then this is the way for the knight to have created the fountain and then escaped without anybody seeing them. Interestingly enough, Alvin really does kind of fit that description. A large person. Also, with the description of queens, their long hands. Turtles have long hands. I can go back to the first slide, which I didn't think was actually going to be relevant. But, like, look at those long fingers on Oogway. It's just kind of a thing, right? So, yeah. It's not super concrete, but those descriptions do apply to Alvin in an interesting way. I think at some point I even saw somebody on like Reddit when I was reading other people's opinions on this, because I wanted to sort of get the community opinion. That's basically what I'm giving you right now. Was that like the pixel size of Alvin is like literally the exact same pixel size of the door, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's like a smoking gun, considering if you're making a sprite sheet you probably would just use the same dimensions. But hey, I'll mention it anyway. Gerson seems to be emphasized by the world of Deltarune way more. He's mentioned on the bench. We know way more about his life. Also, he was the school teacher that Alphys, I almost said Alvin, Alphys is replacing, and obviously he's got this son that seems quite important. In Undertale, he was just a shopkeeper that barely showed up ever. Although he does have one killer line in the kill everyone route. So that was, you know, mainly his claim to fame. As well as, of course, talking about the prophecy of the Deltarune. So, maybe relevant there. Alvin has a line when you talk to him in Chapter 2, where he says, "You heard Alvin mumbling to himself as you walked away. Were you proud of me, father? And is it right for this hammer to..." So, once again, we're bringing up the idea of Alvin's father, Gerson, and this is like a pretty, I would say, heavy-handed hint that there's something more to Alvin than we've seen. Even if he's not the knight, I feel like there's going to be some sort of like side story with him, at least, talking about this. And of course, this is completely Undertale brain, but in Undertale, Gerson trained Undyne to be a knight. It's something he mentions in the No Mercy route, is that there's a hero coming to stop you, blah, 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 that Gerson trained. Am I a hero? No, I'm not a hero, but this fish lady definitely is. So that's interesting, especially I think considering that a lot of people's like brain image of the knight is Undyne's knight armor, just because it's like the Undertale knight armor that we've seen. It is interesting. It's a factor, I would say. So what about what makes him a bad candidate, huh? Why doesn't everyone just hold hands and agree that Alvin is the knight? Well, because Alvin is irrelevant. So this is the biggest one I think I've seen people bring up. Alvin doesn't have a talk sprite or a unique typer value, which is the sound that the characters make when they speak, you know. Like the Banjo-Kazooie. You know how it is. Also, you can completely skip all his dialogue if you don't do the hometown segments. And you know, this is a video about Alvin Knight, so obviously I'm not going to let all of these lie. I'm going to sort of say why I think, well, they're not wrong, obviously. This is objectively true that Alvin is completely skippable at the moment. Why I do think, it still works out in Alvin's favor, personally. So, Alvin being completely skippable up to this point, I don't think ruins his chances of being the knight, nor does, not having a talk sprite or whatever. Because the knight is a mystery, and a cool thing about mysteries is you can't really just, point at the most obvious suspects and be like, it's gotta be one of them, right? If a well-written mystery is made, you can follow the logic that gets you to that conclusion after the fact, but it is still able to surprise you when the reveal happens. You know what I mean? You can't just pull the answer out of nowhere with no build-up. But if the build-up is there, and you just can't quite put all the pieces together until the final moment, that's usually when a mystery is the most satisfying, right? Because then you can go back and reread it and be like, oh, this is when blank happened. So I think Alvin being completely skippable at the moment is fine. And I also think it's probably intentional. I don't think it's even that big of a deal either, because yes, he is completely skippable. But are most players really going to skip him? That's my question to you. Almost every person I've seen play Deltarune after the chapter, maybe after taking a break and then doing it in a separate stream, does talk to everybody in hometown, because that's a huge part of Undertale and Deltarune, right? Is just talking to the characters and getting their wacky dialogue. So I don't think it's necessarily a smoking gun that you don't have to talk to Alvin in the story yet, because I feel like Toby trusts the players that they probably will if they care, and if they don't care to try to solve the mystery, then it doesn't really matter whether they see all the evidence or not, right? Because they were never trying to solve the mystery in the first place, so they're just kind of going along for the ride. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion. I think if Alvin showed up at the school in Chapter 1 and was like, hello, I'm Alvin, I'm a new character that you should care about, people would be a lot more suspicious, and it would make the reveal a lot more obvious when it happens, if it does. Chess theory. Does chess theory kind of debunk this? Maybe. So the way chess theory works is essentially saying that the bosses of each chapter are going to be related to a chess piece, right? And their value on the chessboard. So kings are at the top of that, because if you take the king, you win the game, right? So they have infinite value, essentially. Next on that list is queens, then rooks, and then interestingly, bishops and knights are the same value. And then pawns. And then a lot of people presume the final chapter, chapter 7, because that's that's 6 so far. Chapter 7 will be against the player of the game, either that being Gaster or us actually the real player or something like that. That being as it is, it would mean that we fight a knight in chapter 5, which does seem pretty logical. Given everything that's been built up so far, obviously the knight should be a boss that we fight, right? But it does make sense that the knight wouldn't be the final boss, you know what I mean? The knight is to Asgore what, Gaster is to Flowey in the original Undertale, or Asriel even. The knight is the threat that we're going to have to defeat, and then there's going to be the sort of metatextual thing. Yeah, of course, we're assuming that. We don't know that's going to be true. But if chess theory does work out, that would mean we're fighting a knight in Chapter 5. However, the way Alvin kind of fits into that knight or chess theory spectrum is that he's a bishop and a knight, which is cool because the bishop and the knight are the same value in chess. So it would be kind of funny for the knight to also be a bishop and sort of reference that. However, that would kind of leave us stuck, right? We'd be missing a boss for a chapter in chess theory. What are we going to do then? Fight the board? I mean, it's not impossible, but however, I do think, personally, we already have the answer to this conundrum. And that is that chapter 3 doesn't count. It's also possible chess theory is just not right. I really think chess theory is on the mark, but it's also possible we've only had 2 chapters, that we're going to fight a king, and then we're going to fight a queen, and then we're going to fight a lord, and then we're going to fight a dictator, and then we're going to fight a president, right? It could just be different people in power, different kinds of power. It doesn't necessarily have to keep being chess pieces. the king then queen could have just been a coincidence, right? Although I do think it's spot on, and I just think the fact that chapter 3 was not created by the knight means that it's therefore like out of the running for this theory as it goes. So in chapter 1 we would fight a king, chapter 2 we'd fight a queen, chapter 3 would be exempt, chapter 4 we would fight a rook, chapter 5 we would fight the bishop knight, and then chapter 6 would be a pawn, and chapter 7 would be the player. Of course, we have no idea if any of this is true, but it's my own thoughts on the matter. The third point I have here is it's too obvious. Everybody's picking up on this. If the mystery is supposed to be a mystery, then why do we already know the answer? And I do think it's funny that the 2 points are, he's too irrelevant, and the other one is, he's too obvious. But I can't really blame people because I don't think they have both opinions at once. This is just kind of community opinion. I also don't think this is true, personally. The reason why we think he's too obvious is because we are theory-brained. We have just been watching so many theories that it's just like, oh, well, clearly this all makes sense, so it can't be that. But just your average person playing the game probably would not come to this conclusion immediately, especially like after the game has been fully released and all the chapters are out. Like, there's no way after chapter 2 you'd be thinking, oh, Alvin's the knight, because like the Chris reveal just happened and you haven't had the time to really think it through and be like, does that make sense? And there's so many other like suspicious things revolving around Ralsei and Chris. I don't think you would be thinking about Alvin at all, even if you did read his dialogue. You'd just be thinking like, oh, Alvin's got like daddy issues. Cool. So yeah, I do think it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't watch like all these Deltarune theories and consume all this Deltarune content off like cycle from the Deltarune chapters releasing, because obviously we're in it, so it's really hard to sort of put yourself in the shoes of someone who isn't. But the game is being made for your average person, not us crazy people, so you have to keep that in mind. And then finally, well, idiot, we literally saw Chris make a dark fountain, so clearly they're the knight. And I already kind of touched on why I think this is at least dubious in terms of possibility. Like, it's definitely possible it could be true, but there's a lot of explaining that has to go into it, I think. Interestingly enough, if you do believe in Knight theory, or Chris Knight theory, and you are still watching this video for some reason, maybe you just like to hear me talk. That same video I linked earlier about Ralsei analysis actually has some evidence towards Chris Knight theory, where when Ralsei's talking about creating dark fountains, he turns to Chris specifically, which I do think could just be Ralsei being suspicious that Chris might be the one behind this and not actually knowing who the knight is. But it is pretty strong evidence that there's at least some Chris Knight, connective tissue there. And that, again, would also go against the same argument I used for it being too obvious for Alvin to be the knight. Works the same with Chris Knight, right? Like, we've all had time to think about it and be like, does this make sense? But, like, if you were just playing the chapters and it happened, and then chapter 3 comes out and explains that, yeah, Chris is actually the knight, you wouldn't really think about any of that stuff, right? So, I do think it's interesting. But probably the strongest is the Alvin is irrelevant stuff, and it's the most common, so that's not surprising. Which I do think there's a reason for. So, moving on. Alvin's W's. Now, this isn't about Alvin's wins, although it is kind of. It's about how Alvin fits into all the who, what, when, where, why, hows that I presented earlier. Because why use that format if I wasn't going to bring it back? So here we go. What is Alvin? Well, Alvin is a lightener, which we talked about potentially being a problem, because why would King side with a lightener? But, and this sort of relies on stuff that I've brought up before, Alvin's a lightener with connection to the darkners in the unused classroom. And, King is one of those characters. So is Sham. In my Shadows on the Wall stuff, and even further back, the Origins of Darkners, which was the first theory I put out, I essentially posited that darkners are based on connotations, or like additional meanings assigned to things, sort of like sentimental value almost in some cases. So like Here we go again. I'm going to bring up the same example. Are you guys ready? This is like the 5th time you've heard it. Rules card is the rules card in a card game, literally, in the light world. But the way he is represented in the dark world as being sort of an overly wordy and pretty much useless character aligns with the way people see the rules card, right? The rules card has a bunch of like words on it that really don't matter to you when you're playing a card game because you probably already know the rules. And also, it has no value in a card game, so it's useless or very, worthless. And so that works for almost like in those videos I go over almost every Darkner, with the exception being like characters like Sham, which is interesting. The Chapter 2 characters, like almost all of them make perfect sense. But there are some in Chapter 1 that seem a little weird. And that could be because Alvin has specific connotations about them that another person wouldn't have. And the reason I think this is because in the classroom, if you go to the cabinet in the unused classroom after you clear Chapter 1, there's a drawing of a turtle on the wall, probably Gerson. And this drawing is signed by Alvin. So this means that Alvin probably went to school in this classroom, which I think would line up timeline-wise, and then drew this drawing while he was, in this classroom learning. If that is the case, it adds on to a point later, so keep it in mind. And it also explains why King would side with the Knight, even if they are a Lightner, because King and Alvin have this connection that goes way back. So that's interesting. When would Alvin be able to open these fountains? Now, obviously, this is still completely just like up in the air. We don't really know. But Alvin would definitely have to be hiding in the closet in the computer lab for Chapter 2's Dark Fountain. Maybe he was going to create a fountain in there, and then Noelle and Birdley showed up, so he hid in the closet and was like, well, what do I do now? And then just made the fountain in the closet instead as like a smoke screen for his escape. Because we know that the fountain erupts a bunch of smoke. It would also make sense if he was the one who slams the closet door on us in Chapter 1, which would mean that he created the unused classroom Dark Fountain then, and then came out that door and saw that the closet door was open and was like, oh no, somebody's finding my work, and then closed the door on us in order to, stop us from getting out of there. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure we have no confirmation that the closet Dark Fountain was created by the Knight. And in fact, it seems like it kind of wasn't. So it would be interesting in this sort of scenario where Alvin just thinks that he's closing the door on these kids so that he can make an escape and not be seen coming out of the unused classroom where a Dark Fountain just happened. Without knowing that he is putting them in danger and then leading to them closing the Dark Fountain he just created. I think that's kind of interesting. Where? Well, both locations, as we mentioned earlier, have a connection to Gerson, and Alvin going to these places as his son would prompt people to respect his privacy. I forgot my sentence structure there. I do think it's also possible that this might lead into his motives, which is why is Alvin creating these dark fountains? Is he really doing it for religious reasons? It's possible. Is he doing it to create the roaring? Probably not. He doesn't seem like the type. But maybe Alvin wants to use the Dark Worlds to recreate his lost father. Hence the locations chosen to host the fountains being locations that specifically correspond to Gerson, and why he doesn't seem to be gung-ho to just open like 3 fountains at once and start the roaring. Because he doesn't actually want to start the roaring, he probably doesn't know what it is, like Queen. He's just stumbled into this sort of Dark World stuff, maybe by reading his father's notes, because Gerson says on the bench dialogue that, all my best ideas for writing came to me in my dreams. And dreams and the Dark Worlds are very correlated. You can watch the Shadows on the Wall theory if you want to know more about that. But it's interesting because that drawing on the closet door of the unused classroom is like the one thing that doesn't become a Darkner that we see. So did like Alvin take this Darkner? No, because the drawing's still there. Unless the drawing just created like a new being, which is, again, watch shadows on the wall. But it seems like that's a plausible motive to me. That would be a twist, like obviously on what we're expecting the night to be like. And it also sort of ties into the themes of Deltarune, of like loss, you know? Chris has sort of lost their family structure. Noelle has lost her sister. And then we have the knight who's lost his father. It would kind of all go together, you know? It would also really be tragic if Noelle loses her father, and then we go into this dark world where it's all about a guy who's lost his father and been evil, and Noelle kind of has to, you know, or at least not maybe been evil, but done bad things that endangered people, and Noelle has to kind of like come to terms with the fact that like despite all the pain she's feeling, she can't go down that same path. Or in the Snowgrave route, she just usurps him and becomes the main villain or something. Who knows? It sort of, it has that narrative parallels that really make it seem plausible to me, a person who likes narratives. Anyway, finally, how Gerson used to be a smith, a blacksmith. So perhaps there was some sort of special connection between whatever Alvin is using to create these fountains and Gerson, which would again put even more emphasis on this relationship. Some people mentioned in a forum post on the Deltarune like fandom wiki about this that Alvin's line that we mentioned earlier, where he says, "Were you proud of me, father? And is it right for this hammer to," might not actually be in reference to what I thought it was, which was essentially Alvin saying, "Is it right for this hammer to be buried with you?" You know what I mean? Like this hammer was special in some way, and the fact that it's like buried under the ground is causing some sort of problem. However, it could also be the case that Alvin has taken this hammer and is using it to open the dark fountains. Like blacksmith's hammer notably has a sharp side and a flat side, so he could be using the sharp side to open up these fountains. And maybe Gerson did back in the day too, who knows. And he's saying, is it right for me to have this hammer when really it should be with you, right? Like, I'm not saying he dug up his father's grave, but it's possible that, like, the hammer would have been a better choice for the item to represent Gerson, but Alvin selfishly kept it to, like, maintain his connection with his father. And so, like, maybe in the end of this arc, the thing that Alvin will do is, like, bury the hammer in the graveyard and be like, I'm done making fountains. That kind of a thing. As a symbolic connection to, like, letting go of his father. It all comes together. Finally, my own thoughts. So all of that was sort of community consensus, things I've heard over time, and sort of the general ideas of why Alvin being the knight makes sense to people. But here's my own thoughts and how they sort of tie into my theory. So, in other words, this is where it goes off the rails. Is it possible Gerson was a boss monster? So, as far as we know, boss monster is just the description of the kind of monster that Asgore, Toriel, and Asriel are. But the literal description is a monster that is immortal as long as their child is not growing. So as soon as they have a child, then they can age, which is why Toriel has glasses in Deltarune, but not in Undertale, because she's aged farther years than she did in that universe. At least, like, it seems the timeline is completely, like, different, obviously. In the case that Gerson was a boss monster, which there is some evidence, seems how he's still alive in Undertale, and he talks about fighting in the monster and human war with Asgore, which, like, he's clearly an old man. But if he's had this kid in Undertale, and that's why he's aging, then it kind of makes sense. Like, he didn't age for a long time, and then he had this kid recently, so he started aging now. And it explains how he'd survived that long. It could have just been because he's a turtle. But I do think this would add an interesting wrinkle to the whole Alvin thing. Because if Gerson is a boss monster, then that would literally make Alvin responsible for his father's death. Like, if Alvin was never born, Gerson would still be immortal, right? So I think that would be a very interesting sort of thing to dive into. Especially considering that, like, the same thing is kind of happening to people we do care about, which is Toriel and Asgore. or at least Toriel, with Asriel, versus like Gerson, who we probably don't care about that much, but we can relate it to our own characters. So I think that's interesting. And then here's another one. Does Alvin have some connection to the disappearance of Des? This could also be a motive for him opening Dark Fountains, by the way. If Des did indeed like get lost in a Dark Fountain forever somehow, which who knows, maybe. The reason I speculate this is because Noelle talks about going for adventures behind the graveyard. And notably, the forest behind the graveyard is right behind the church, right? And I don't really know. It probably isn't true that Alvin like lives in the church. I would assume he has a house outside of it, but maybe it's got like a house connected to it or something. Who knows? Or he could have just been working late that night. But when they went exploring, we have some evidence to suggest that might have been when Des disappeared, is one of those sort of exploring adventures, because we're bringing it up, right? We wouldn't be bringing it up unless it was going to be important to the story. And if that is true, then that means Alvin might have seen what happened. But just like Chris and Asriel and Noelle was unable to like use that information to help Des, so is now trying his best now. Or maybe, who knows, maybe Alvin's the one who opened that Dark Fountain way back in the day that Des got lost in. And it's his responsibility now, he feels, to try to find her. It's something to think about that I don't see people talking about. Does Alvin know about Gaster? Now, this is an interesting one. And does Gaster care about Alvin? See, we assume that Gaster's like going to be the final boss, right? Because he's being built up. He's in like a lot more of this game than he was Undertale. And if Alvin is the knight and then is going to be sort of usurped as the main villain by Gaster afterwards, do they know about each other? Like, did Alvin talk to Jevil and he knows as much as we do that there's some sort of being communicating with these Darkners? Is he working together with Gaster? In the Shadows on the Wall theory, I was saying that Gaster wants the roaring to happen in order to sort of reconstitute his being out of people's imaginations. Does he know about that? And is that like what inspired him to start trying to recreate Gerson? Maybe. Interestingly, with anagrams, which it does come up in Undertale characters time and time again. Ralse is obviously an anagram of Asriel. Asriel Dreamer is an anagram for serial murderer. What was the other one? Oh, Chris is an anagram for risk. I don't know if there's a Susie one, but I mean, Deltarune is an anagram for Undertale. Anagrams, clearly there's some precedence there. Gerson is an anagram for really, like I went into an anagram solver just to make sure. The only two words that came up were goners, which obviously have a deep connection with Gaster. And like, what was it? It was like genros, which were like Japanese, elderly advisors, which also does kind of make sense because Gerson in Undertale was sort of like an elderly advisor to Asgore. So, I don't know, they both kind of work. Obviously, Goners is more interesting for us right now. Alvin is an anagram for Anvil, or Villain. Villain with just one L and no second I. I think that one's a little bit of a stretch, though it is kind of funny. Anvil makes a lot of sense, though, because Gerson was a smith, and taking from a dream symbolism website, so take this with a huge grain of salt, the symbolism of an anvil is that of forging new life, creating new beginnings, and so on. So signifies creativity in its rawest sense, which, if we're still tying into the Shadows on the Wall theory, and Alvin is trying to create his father again, literally forging new life, a new beginning, that would make a lot of sense. And I never would have even thought of that if I didn't search it up, so it's nice. Something we've talked about before is potentially the knight pilfering some Darkners from the unused classroom. We know we left King behind, and King was clearly sort of a devoted subject, but we don't see any Queen cards at all in Chapter 1. as well as we don't see any of the other jacks either. We see that the other kings got put in prison. But we don't see any of the other chess pieces. We only see pawns. Actually, we see horsey and bishop, but only those two. We don't see any black chess pieces. That's what it was, which is interesting, considering, those are what you would consider like, ooh, the dark chess pieces versus, classic light versus dark stuff. There's probably some other ones too, where it's like, there's not a full set here. And obviously the explanation could just be those got lost over time, but maybe he's building himself a little army that we're going to have to face off against in chapter 5. Because I think that'd be cool. It'd be like, oh, now you have to remember how to act against pawn men all of a sudden. That'd be interesting. It's sort of like what usually happens in RPGs, where you have like a... what's a good example of this that I can think of off the top of my head? Oh, boy. It's probably Earthbound, but I don't remember any of the enemies' names specifically. But okay, in an RPG, you'll face off against, like, Angry Crow in, like, the first area. And then in, like, the third area, there'll be, like, Rageful Crow, which will be, like, a color-swapped palette. That's what could happen, essentially, with Alvin's Army of Darkness taken from Chapter 1 and maybe even Chapter 2. It's like, the harder versions of enemies you already fought. And then, talking about it in terms of the other theories, there is one really big thing that I haven't brought up yet. I think over the course of talking about this, we mostly brought up everything that I was going to say at this point. One big thing that people did mention on the last theory, which I did want to touch on, because they're right, obviously, is that when you game over in Survey Program before you've completed Chapter 1, Gaster says, and so the world was covered in darkness, which would presume that if the player characters aren't continuing their journey, that the roaring does occur. So it kind of goes against the idea that Gaster is planning on the roaring happening, because that would mean he wants us to lose, right? Which, like, does that really make sense? So here's my thoughts about it, okay? I think the most important thing to remember when it comes to Shadows on the Wall is that Gaster needs all the memories about him to be in one place in order to be reformed, essentially. So obviously he needs Alphys, who remembers him as a scientist. He needs Asgore, who remembers him as a scientist. He needs the skeletons, who remember him as, like, whatever he was to them, maybe, probably. But he does also need us, because, like, we're the ones who are searching him out. So it's possible that maybe Gaster's actually going to be a secret boss, or even if he's the main Chapter 7 boss, that even if the roaring occurs, which, based on Ralsei's prophecy, it does seem like some sort of apocalyptic event is inevitable in this universe, and whether the heroes are there to stop it or not is the differentiating factor. Maybe if we give up and stop playing the game, then Gaster doesn't actually get his full form. So he does need us to keep fighting in this, like, back and forth with the Knight, even though if we give up, the Knight will still create the roaring. They'll create the roaring without Gaster, essentially. And I guess the reason why, even if Alvin was the Knight and wasn't planning on making the roaring, that the roaring would still happen, is because we wouldn't be going around to close the additional fountains. So at some point that darkness would overflow. Like, let's say we gave up in Chapter 1, there'd be nothing to stop Queen from influencing Noelle from creating more fountains, and then the roaring would happen, right? So it's possible that just, like, future circumstances would make the roaring happen if we weren't there to, like, stop them, essentially. But it's a roaring that Gaster doesn't want, because he needs us and everyone else to have full knowledge of him before it happens. So maybe he even needs, like, us to meet some of the other characters he's influenced, like the Spamptons and Jevils of this world. Like, we need to collect all those items in order to fully form him or something. Otherwise, we're going to get an ending where we fight, like, the Vessel or Chris or something. It's possible. When was the other one that I really wanted to talk about? I'll pause and look. You know what it was? It was the closet. I do think in my closet theory video, I mentioned that there's a possibility that the closet dark world is actually just a breach of a much larger dark world, like breaching up into the closet. Because those pillars that spike out in the first area of the closet dark world kind of look like broken floorboards. So it's possible that maybe when Susie and Chris ended up inside that closet, that the floor was sort of weakening due to the pressure of the dark fountain underneath. Maybe even the pressure of it being released in the room next over. Something like that, you know what I mean? It was like weakening the area under that floor, and then they literally did fall into this other dark world, right? So how does that kind of go together with Alvin Night? Well, it does tie into the fact that Alvin didn't think there was a fountain in the closet, which is why he would close the door on Chris and Susie in there, because he doesn't really want the fountains closing, and also he doesn't really want to endanger children, I don't think, is his main... I don't think that's his main goal. And then it also kind of works out to a point that Alvin maybe has been inside that dark world as well. Like, maybe the church has a leak for that dark fountain too. And that's where Alvin first learned about the dark fountains. And it could also explain why maybe he knows about Gaster or is being influenced by Gaster in some way to, like, open these fountains in the hopes of eventually causing the roaring, even though he doesn't know what the roaring is, right? Like, essentially, Gaster, in that case, would be the Palpatine of this universe, right? Where he'd be on the sidelines guiding both us, the player, and Alvin, the knight, to create the perfect circumstances for him to come back into being. Like, the roaring has to happen, but we have to gather all these items of these followers first so they can't turn into, like, stone and he'd lose parts of himself, you know? So yeah, that's basically my thoughts. If you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more. Maybe leave your suggestions on what else you'd want to see me take my take on. I honestly wouldn't be too pressed if you wanted to see my take on Noel Night, because I think Noel Night has pretty strong evidence as well. And that one's obviously more obscure. So I'd be interested to know if you wanted to see me do, like, the same sort of format as this, but with Noel Night. Because I think, or, like, we'll do, like, Noel / Mayor Holiday Night, because all of their reasonings and placements are fairly similar. But mostly Noel. And then, yeah, let me know what you think about Alvin Night. And if you're a Chris Knight truther, you can tell me in the comments too. Honestly, I think Chris Knight could be very interesting. I just don't buy it. So if it ends up being true, I win both. If it ends up being true or false, I win. Playing both sides. Yeah. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe. And I will see you guys next time in another, like, 2 months, 5 years, however long it takes. Maybe they'll just release maybe Toby will just release the next chapters by then. Okay. Bye.